Welcome to another video from explainingthefuture.com. This time I'm going to talk about the singularity, which is an important concept in the whole area of future studies. And in particular I want to talk about the singularity in relation to a range of future technologies. But you cry, what is the singularity? Well, we should offer some definition, so let's have a go at that. And it is a tricky concept to put into words and to get your head around, but I would define the singularity like this. The singularity is a technological event horizon beyond which we cannot see, a moment in future history when exponential progress makes the impossible possible. And the idea of an event horizon, something we can't see beyond, comes from astrophysics, where they'll tell us, for example, a black hole has got an event horizon around the edge. We can't see beyond the event horizon of the black hole because even light is sucked into the black hole beyond that point. So this is about saying some point in the future, amazing things will happen. And we can't predict what those amazing things will be because they're so amazing we can't actually understand them today. That's the event horizon we're talking about. And I think one of the people who gave us a good understanding of this, or that allows us to get our heads around it, was Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction author way back in the 1960s. And Arthur C. Clarke wrote a lot of amazing science fiction stories, but he also wrote some very interesting non-fiction books. And in particular, back in 1961, he wrote a book called Profiles of the Future, in which he had this particular line, where he said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think this line is very useful to keep in our heads when we're trying to get an understanding of the singularity. Because what we're really saying here is, in a few decades' time, the singularity will effectively again blur the line between technology and magic. And the key thing on the slide here is the word again. And I think this is what we get from thinking about Arthur C. Clarke and his idea about blurring magic and technology sort of definition. Because if you think about it, we are heading towards potentially a singularity, but not really the singularity, because we've had singularities before. Because if we imagine going back in time, say 50 years or 100 years or something like that, and we try to explain the world of today to someone from that period in time, we would struggle. We'd have no common point of reference. Imagine trying to explain a smartphone and going online with it and using social media and buying things online and downloading digital content. These things are so far removed from our people, we would have known in the world only 50, 100 years ago. They're extraordinarily different. So we've gone through already several moments of singularity across human history. And I think recognizing that is important for two reasons. One, it makes it clear that the idea we could get to a point of exponential technological progress where everything changes and we can't comprehend it today because we aren't there yet, that clearly can happen because it's happened already. And the other thing this hopefully reminds us is that the singularity, although it's always talked about as being a point in future history, will probably be a long transition. You couldn't look back from today to 100 years ago and say, well, when exactly did the world become so different from what people experienced? It would be fundamentally new. We'd have gone through a point of singularity, but clearly it has happened. And I think the same will happen again. We will only recognize we've gone through the next singularity by looking back at it many years afterwards. So that's the broad idea of this fact that technology is going to be so powerful we can do extraordinary things. What are the implications of that and that idea? Well, I would suggest there's two important things that come out of that. The first one is that the idea of a singularity, next decade after that, does potentially give us hope. It gives us the hope that technological solutions will be found to some of the grand challenges we face today. How do we clean up all the pollution we put in the oceans? How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with resource scarcity, pending water scarcity, energy scarcity, things like that? Well, don't worry. We'll come up with some amazing solutions. Post-singularity using the technology will exist then. So hope is given to us as a species by a belief in singularity. And also hope is given to individuals. One of the things that I often find as a futurist is people contact me and they say, when will this particular new medical technology, some of the things I'm about to come on to, when will these become available? Because if they do, it'll transform my life. And you have to be very careful how you handle those sort of requests for information, because people clearly are hanging on every word you give them back. But certainly it's the case that medical science could be extraordinarily more advanced in a couple of decades' time. And the key thing to keep remembering here is the exponential progress part, because every new technology builds on other technologies. Every advance in AI helps advances in organic sciences, and quantum computing helps in the modelling, and all the things come together as we're going to come on to. So the singularity potentially gives us hope. But the problem with that is you can take that hope too far. There is a danger that we go, well, don't worry, in 10 or 20 years, we'll hit the technological singularity and everything will become possible. We'll have amazing technology, so we can just do nothing today about all these big problems like climate change and resource usage and stuff. We can say, it doesn't matter, we'll fix it in the future. And of course, the only reason we might be able to fix it in the future with exponential technological progress is because we do radical things today to help get us there. So we have to be very careful we don't use the idea of singularity as a sort of get-out clause that stops us taking appropriate action in the present. Now, let's think about the singularity and technologies. And the technology that's always associated with the singularity is AI, artificial intelligence. And I'm not going to get into great debates about the meaning and the nature of AI in this video. Why? Because I did it in my last video. Go and watch that if you want to know about what I think about AI and how it's defined today in the real world as opposed to how it was defined in bizarre ways many decades ago. And still some people cling to old and not very useful definitions of artificial intelligence. But ignoring all those debates, what we see on the screen here is what I would call the singularity loop. And what it tries to show us is that intelligence, however we define it, cognitive ability, can be used to create technology. So our very early ancestors picked up a piece of wood or a piece of bone or something, and they forged a club out of it or a weapon or something, and that helped them to survive better, gave them more opportunities to develop their own intelligence, and then they could do it again and again, and they went round the loop. And today, this sort of loop clearly is in operation around us all the time. If we think about a modern microprocessor, it contains billions, sometimes tens of billions of individual components, transistors and other things on the chip. And the practicalities of working out how you wire them all up inside that chip, how all the interconnects get placed, is an extraordinarily complicated topological task. Even if a human being spent their entire life trying to work out how you did that for one chip, they couldn't do it. Probably tens of people together couldn't do it, maybe even hundreds of people couldn't do it. The only way we can make complicated microprocessors today is to use existing microprocessors to run programs that enable us to work out the topology of how we put everything on the chip. So already technology is helping us become smarter, which helps us make more technology, and we keep going around this loop. And that is why, quite understandably, many people link artificial intelligence to the singularity. The idea being that as intelligence gets more and more advanced, artificial intelligence gets more advanced, we create more and more powerful technology, which creates more powerful artificial intelligence, and it goes round and round and round. Now, that's a powerful argument. And it's to do with that argument where people will basically tell you, in some cases anyway, that the singularity is not so much just about this event horizon in the future and exponential technological progress, it's particularly about the creation of beyond human intelligence. Once we have beyond human intelligence, some people would argue we will arrive at the singularity. And that may or may not be true. But this idea of beyond human intelligence clearly would help us to get to a point of exponential technological progress and to do things that today are deemed to be impossible. However, there are different ways we can actually potentially arrive at a point of having developed beyond human intelligence. The most obvious one, the one that science fiction certainly focuses on, is that we might develop a single AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is more intelligent than a human being and can go and do amazing things that we humans won't be able to understand. That's certainly a possibility. But I think it's far more likely we will get to a point of beyond human intelligence in other ways. For example, we could get to a point of beyond human intelligence via human augmentation, by adding potentially, say, a brain-computer interface into a human being. That human being could then interface to computer technology, have enhanced cognitive ability, you'd have beyond human intelligence. The next way, and I think it's even more likely, is we will have the mass networking of lower level artificial intelligence systems. So if you've got lots and lots of low-level artificial intelligence all linked together, you don't necessarily get an artificial general intelligence, something with awareness and all those sort of things that some people think are so important in the artificial intelligence debate, and I think really are not important in the artificial intelligence debate. But if you put lots of low-level artificial intelligence together, you get a lot of cognitive power. And as you'll hopefully see as we come to some of the topics I'm about to come on to, that cognitive power can be really significant in pushing technology forward. So it would be not beyond human in the sense of could it actually mirror human capabilities and exceed them, but in terms of having massive cognitive single capacity, would exceed normal human intelligence. And then the final way we could potentially get beyond human intelligence is to crowdsource lots of human minds. And I think this is really where we're starting to see beyond human intelligence emerging already today. In the past, pre-internet world, it was very difficult to get a lot of people working on a problem. You got to a point where you had too many cooks spoiling the broth, and actually however many more people you brought in, you didn't get a better result because there was no practical way of pulling all their ideas together and getting value from having loads and loads of contributions. But with the growth of the internet and online forums and all the tools around that, we now clearly can crowdsource human capabilities to have a greater mental ability added by every little bit of extra human in the mix. So if we think today about things like, I don't know, the Linux operating system created through an open source process, loads of people can contribute, hundreds, thousands of people can contribute, tens of thousands potentially, to make this operating system work. That couldn't be done in the past. And I think we're seeing today, for example, climate change. Lots of human minds are brought into this debate to study climate change and think about mitigation, facilitated by the crowdsourcing of ideas online. So I think this is really where we're starting to see beyond human intelligence emerging. It's a different form of intelligence, but it is greater than what we've seen previously. And this idea of linking together people via the internet to crowdsource their brains and linking together technology to get more sophisticated systems, and of course linking the two, linking people into these systems, is an idea discussed in my favourite book ever written, which is this book down here, quite a big, thick, lovely book called Metaman by a guy called Gregory Stock. And Metaman is all about, well, it's all about Metaman, as you could probably guess, where Metaman is described as a global superorganism comprised of humanity and its technology. So basically what Stock is saying in this book is that we've got to a point now where if you say stood up on the moon, as you do, if you stood up on the moon and you look back to planet Earth at night, you would see a maze of lights of connectivity across the planet. And he says this is like a creature, this superorganism. It's comprised of lots of individual creatures, human beings, linked together through technology to make something bigger. And you know, he describes the birth of Metaman as the most important thing to happen on the planet for about 3 billion years. People linked together through technology. And he was saying this back in 1993. It really is an extraordinary book, Gregory Stock's Metaman. I don't think it sold terribly well, sadly, but I thought it was an amazing book. So I would keep that in mind in that context of beyond human intelligence. It doesn't have to be this fantastic AI sitting somewhere in Google or Microsoft or IBM's research labs. It can be the fact that we're linking people together, linking technology together to have new ways of doing more amazing cognitive work. Now, with that said, let's think through two specific technologies that are potentially going to be involved with the singularity. So, approaching the singularity is going to involve AI. AI is the big technology of certainly this decade. There's no doubt it'll be a big part of the singularity if we get that. But my own guess is that AI alone is not enough. AI is really a means to an end. AI doesn't really help us solve things unless we've got other things we can do, because AI allows us to do those things, if you see what I mean. So AI has to be applied in combination in a complementary way to other new technologies to get us, I think, to the singularity. What are these technologies? Well, first on my list would be genetic modification and synthetic biology. I'm going to give you a list here and then come back and we'll look at them in more detail. But basically, the technologies where we start to understand and take control of organic matter. Secondly, sort of linked to that, bioprinting, printing organic matter, living stuff coming out of a 3D printer. Next one, cybernetics, taking technology, artificially designed technology and integrating it into the human body. And that might involve the first two here as well. Fourthly, molecular self-assembly, the idea that we can start to put things together inorganically the same way life puts things together organically. It's wacky stuff. And finally, probably underpinning all of this, quantum computing. So let's take a look at these technologies and think about them in the context of the singularity. The first one then, genetic modification and synthetic biology, known as SynBio in the synthetic biology community. It's quicker to say. Genetic modification is basically the technology we've had for many decades now that allows us to change an organism's DNA to alter its characteristics. So, for example, we might take a certain variety of corn and tweak a few genes to make the corn drought resistant or more resistant to climate change or something like that. We've been doing that for a lot of time to increase yields and to make new types of crops. Highly controversial in some parts of the world, widely accepted in other parts of the world, but certainly it's going on. But basically, genetic modification is really saying, let's take an existing living thing and tweak it. The point of analysis where you start is a total thing, a piece of corn or a fish or a cow or whatever it is, and then you make changes to it as an entity. But there is another approach to altering living stuff, and that is synthetic biology, which is a discipline that started out in computer science. It started out with computer scientists saying, what can we learn from biology that we could apply in the computing? And when they said, no, let's turn it around. Let's actually say how we can use computing to take control of biology. And what they did was to say, we won't look at entire living things and try and understand the whole thing and then tweak it, because that's really, really hard. They said, what we'll do is we'll break biology down, break living things down, break DNA down into definable parts, definable modules. And we'll understand how these modules work, and therefore we can mask the complexity, because one person can understand this module and someone can understand that one and someone can understand that one, but you can put them together knowing their function. You don't have to know what goes on inside each of these DNA blocks, but someone's worked it out for you, told you what it is, and you can put them together in a CAD package. There are synthetic biology CAD packages where you can design new living things from standardized DNA parts, and then you can create them by various means in the lab. So synthetic biology is basically, it's a bit like genetic modification, starting from nothing, building upwards, rather than starting from a living thing and building and tweaking it. And there are already companies doing amazing things with synthetic biology. One of them is a company called Amyris, which I think I've got out here on the wonderful thing called the internet. Amyris, as it says, it describes itself as the world's leading manufacturer of sustainable ingredients made with synthetic biology, etc. It basically has found ways to use plant sugars and to ferment them into all sorts of useful things by building things biobrick by biobrick in its CAD packages to make new living stuff. And this is clearly a science with enormous possibilities. If we can start to make biofuels, bioplastics, new types of pharmaceuticals from very easily available raw materials, here cornstarch and things, but it could be, say, algae growing in tanks, which just requires a bit of sunlight and to keep the process going. This could be an amazingly powerful thing in terms of solving resource scarcity. So synthetic biology offers enormous potential. And if you think about this, what we're really saying is this is all about taking control of organic matter to do amazing stuff. And that is a fundamental concept of the singularity. The impossible becomes possible. We can suddenly find a way to have new types of raw materials in not infinite supply, but much more wider supply than we could have today. We don't have to ship things around the world so much. We can just grow the raw materials we need where we need them. That sort of links a little bit to bioprinting, which is, just as it sounds, bioprinting is printing living materials using a 3D printing process, normally by putting down layers of cells into what's called a biopaper, a little hydrogel that holds them together. You put down a layer of cells, another layer of cells, another layer of cells, or normally clumps of cells bound together, and then the cells will quietly rearrange themselves into a living thing. So, for example, if you want to 3D print part of, say, a kidney, you don't have to bioprint all the capillaries. You put roughly the right cells in roughly the right places, and the cells rearrange to form what you require, because that's what life does. Life rearranges cells to make the design according to what's stored in the DNA of the thing that you're trying to make. There are many companies developing this as well. One of the great pioneers of bioprinting is Organovo. They're now selling bioprinted liver tissues for use in drug testing. The company's recently restructured to be fundamentally focused on bioprinting for drug development and other things also related to drug development. But there are also still pioneers thinking about, will we be able to bioprint tissues for human transplantation? Will we be able to, for example, bioprint a kidney or a liver or a heart to transplant into a human being? That will clearly be revolutionary. It would change medicine, it would change transplant surgery at a stroke, but potentially it could go broader than that. Because there are also teams working on in situ bioprinting. So rather than printing an organ or a part of an organ for transplantation into a person, actually design a machine that can remove damaged cells from the body and replace them with new cells. The Wake Forest Institute in the United States, linked into the US Army, has been working on this for many years, trying to look at treating burn victims using an in situ bioprinter. There have been various experiments on rats which have shown great potential. So this might develop in the future. And in the title sequence to this video, you'll have briefly seen my own depiction of a bioprinter printing a heart. This sort of stuff is not here yet by any means, but 10 years out, 20 years out, it's a possibility. And when we can do that, we might get in situ bioprinters we don't just use to help us with medical problems like burns and that type of thing. We might start to, for example, have a face printer, which is what the image here I put together a few years ago is trying to demonstrate. The idea that we might be able to have a machine that removes cells from our body, both skin and bone, and replaces them with newly printed cells, which will slowly come together over time. There'd still be a bit of a healing process involved in this. But you could, for example, have your face scanned when you were 18 and have it reapplied every 10 years to maintain perpetual youth. Or, for example, if you wanted extra muscles, you could have them printed onto the body. Bioprinting offers extraordinary potential. And people say, who would ever consent to have a printer add to their body? Well, look at how cosmetic surgery is used today and how attitudes to that have changed over the last 20 years. I think when bioprinting exists, its cosmetic application will take off, let alone its medical application. Now, that gets us a bit towards cybernetics, changing the human body with technology. But particularly here, I want to focus on the fact that if we can develop brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, then potentially we could start to change ourselves not just in terms of our physical capabilities, but our mental capabilities. We could develop new cognitive abilities with inbuilt parts of the body which allow us to link directly to computers. I was talking about that a few minutes ago. Beyond human intelligence might arrive in the first cyborgs rather than in AI. And as I discussed back in my metaverse video, a couple of videos back, potentially if you can link a brain-computer interface into the body in a direct way, you can put people into virtual reality worlds which seem completely real, and you can link people's brains together, which clearly offers opportunities to develop beyond human intelligence. It might be that we literally network human beings, brains to brain to brain. We can't really think about the implications of this because it's beyond our, by definition, our mental capabilities to think about this. In time, as we get developments in genetic modification and synthetic biology, we also may be able to make BCIs, brain-computer interfaces, augmentations of the body that are organic. And indeed, my guess is we won't really see massive changes to the human body in terms of cybernetics until the implants are organic. And then you can start to go, well, is it cybernetics or not? Because it depends on our view of technology, doesn't it? On our view of ourselves. Are we machines? It's a question that's often pondered in the future studies area. And many people go, no, we're not machines, we're special. Computers are machines, we're completely different. But when you start to get to the area where you start to think about synthetic biology and bioprinting and genetic modification, we become a machine conceptually in terms of how we're dealing with ourselves. The paradigms mix. These are really fundamental questions. Anyway, if we get to the point where we could actually say have some sort of genetic modification, some sort of genetic vector that's actually put into our body to cause us to grow a BCI, that clearly would change the way we can. It would change the nature of our cells, but also the nature of our thinking and our cognitive capabilities. Also here, if we think about not just altering our cells, but altering the physical world around us, potentially we will learn to take the technologies of life, which are basically the technologies of self-assembly. People and animals and plants and things aren't put together using production tools. They grow without production tools using the code of DNA. Could we take that same principle and apply it to inorganic stuff? Could we start to manufacture things in a fundamentally new way? And molecular self-assembly is basically this. It is the ultimate form of nanotechnology, where inorganic products build themselves without tools. And when you first say that, you go, that is bonkers. Remember, singularity is when the impossible becomes possible. But also remember, every living thing on the planet has self-assembled itself already. Self-assembly is part of everyday life. We just can't control it as human beings yet in inorganic systems. Now, this is a long way into the future, but there are already protein engineers, and I love the fact there's a job titled protein engineer these days, protein engineers who are making things called foldamers, which are programmable polymers. And basically they're polymers with lots of little sort of, like Lego-like sort of nodules on them, little pits and troughs. The idea of molecular self-assembly, you can think of it like saying, get all the parts you might need to make, say, a smartphone, and make them at a molecular level, and chuck them into a vessel and shake that vessel, and all the parts will hit each other at the right angle, a good bit of Brownian motion, they'll click together like Lego, and you'll have a final thing. And foldamers are the very, very first starting point of thinking, how can we make things like that happen? Finally here, quantum computing. Quantum computers, I've talked about quite a bit on my Explaining Computers channel, so I won't say a lot of detail on it here, but quantum computers process information not using ones and zeros, using bits, but using quantum bits, qubits. And these are represented by quantum mechanical states. And for many years, people have said quantum computers will never arrive, it'll never work. But IBM, Google, and various other companies have been making extraordinary progress in the past 5 years. If we look out to the web again, and there's all sorts of places you can go. IBM is doing extraordinary stuff with quantum computing. Just look around its website there. A company called Xanadu is making amazing developments with photonic chips, which allow us to have quantum computing. Doesn't require to be super cooled. And if you want to know a lot about quantum computing, look across to the Explaining Computers website, go to the quantum page, and there's all sorts of information here. My update videos I do every year, but also there's information on all the major pioneers and what they're doing. So it is extraordinary what's going on with quantum computing. And the reason I mention quantum computing here is that the things I've just been talking about will probably require quantum computing to make them work. If you want to actually develop genetic modification, synthetic biology, cybernetics, molecular self-assembly, you have to be able to understand and model matter. And you can't do that with a conventional computer, not very, very well, because molecular systems of ourselves and inorganic stuff are quantum in nature. If you want to model molecular systems, you have to have a quantum system to do it, hence a quantum computer. And I think today this is yet to really be understood in many, many areas. The quantum computing experts know it. They know that molecular modeling is a really big, important thing in quantum computing, but still the popular press goes on about security and code breaking, all that sort of stuff. The reason we're going to use quantum computers is to understand better the physical world and to help us manipulate the physical world using the sort of technologies I've just talked about. So, where does this leave us in terms of the singularity? Well, it is absolutely possible that by the 2030s, or maybe beyond that, maybe the 2040s, exponential technological progress, development, building on development, particularly quantum computing and AI giving us a platform for all the other things we just talked about, it might make it possible for the impossible to become possible again. Think back to Arthur C. Clarke, that blurring line between technology and magic. So, potentially, we are going to be at a point, a decade or two out, where we can start to really fundamentally deal with the big challenges of our day, the challenges by and large we've created by our success as being a species that's taken over the whole planet. Things like climate change, pollution, resource depletion, etc. We might find new ways to make raw materials, things like synthetic biology, and to clean up the planet and make it habitable again for people in the future. However, as I sort of hinted at the start, there is a danger that we say, oh, don't worry today, the singularity will solve it for us tomorrow, we'll just ignore stuff. And there's also a danger that we won't have enough materials left to do this with. If we don't use the opportunity we have now to start pushing technology forward, it might be too late, not that many years out. I think this is something that people are starting to realise more and more and more. We're on a planet which is really at a tipping point in terms of what we can achieve now and in the future. And if we don't use the resources we have left in our relatively stable position as a civilization at the moment, as a springboard for success tomorrow, it might be too late in the future. And this really takes us to an issue I'm going to talk about in my next video, which is in part sustainability, but it's beyond sustainability. It's not just about consuming less and conserving resources and making less pollution. It's also about finding more, going beyond the planet into space in search of more resources. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the singularity. It is a tricky thing to get your head around, but hopefully I've given you things to think about. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.